Okay, well, you've had the main course. This is a bit of a footnote. And it's following up the core line of trying to reconceive what we're doing when we live with and do church with people who we refer to as having disabilities. And I put it in that kind of awkward way because it's a very local, modern, historical configuration that we think that the problem is doing ministry for people with disabilities. So you've heard already two ways of trying to re-narrate what's at stake when we're asking the question, how do we treat everyone as invited into the body of Christ. And I'm going to sort of wrap up what we have to say from the main stage here by going back to the beginning of the story of Christianity. I'm going to give you a little piece of the project that John Swinton and I have worked on a few years ago, which has now yielded the fruit of the book called Disability in the Christian Tradition, a reader. And you have a handout on your table there that I'll go through that gives you some texts, most of which come from the reader. And the reason we thought the reader would be an important resource for the church is that once you begin to look at what Christians thought about and said about life with people that we think about today as disabled, you realize that we're actually we've lost a lot of what Christians thought about these issues. So there's a very long and complex story about how we've gotten to where we are. And what I want to do today is just take us back to the first 400 years of the early Christians after Jesus was on earth, and how they thought about issues that we think about as disabling. And one of the main things I want to draw your attention to is the reality that the general Western sense that everybody is a human being and has equal value, which is now something that the culture has at large, and the church is, oddly enough, being pushed by the Americans with Disabilities Act to think harder about disability. In fact, that whole sensibility came from Christianity, and that's one of the main takeaways I want to illustrate for you this morning. So I'm focusing on the earliest period of Christianity between the life of Jesus Christ and the conversion of the Emperor Constantine to Christianity, and more specifically, his Christianization of the empire through the Edict of Milan in 313, which legalized the practice of Christianity, which up to that point had been seen as politically subversive because it attacked the gods of the emperor and the gods of nation. Up to that point, Christianity had very much been a minority sect, and it had been viewed with suspicion, and that suspicion drove spasms of persecution. We know about Christians being sent to the gladiatorial games to sort of fight for their lives as a mode of execution, and that's one, particularly memorable part of that first 300 years of the Christian era. But there were, across many regions of the early empire, Roman Empire, there were spasms of persecution. It wasn't sort of a concerted effort, but local rulers would say, these guys are disrupting our political world, and they had the right to, and they did execute Christians in various ways. So for this reason, the martyrs are very much part of Christian self-identity. When Christians thought of themselves, they couldn't think of themselves without thinking of the martyrs. And of course, that was not difficult to do since they followed someone who was martyred. And this also means that much early Christian writing in the what's called the patristic era takes the form of apologia, which is a an explanation to non-Christians why they shouldn't see Christians as subversive. Christians were going out of their way to say, actually, what we do is good for you. It's good for the nation. It's how things were meant to be, so you shouldn't kill us. That's relevant for our topic because as they were making that defense, something solidified amongst Christians that we can call the rule of human solidarity. Those who were being exterminated and persecuted by the state and society, and who followed a God-man who'd been exterminated and persecuted by society, came to have a deep sympathy for all marginalized human lives. And one of the ways this developed very early on, in fact, we don't, as far as we know, it happened immediately amongst the early Christians, is that they began to reject the exposure of disabled and healthy infants. So it was simply taken for granted that disabled children would be left on the hillside to be taken by animals or just die of exposure. As one commentator notes, it can be categorically asserted that there were no laws in classical antiquity, Greek or Roman, that prohibited the killing by exposure or otherwise of the defective newborn. So in both classical Greece and Rome, disfiguring conditions had generally been understood as caused by supernatural powers that needed to be exercised and purified for the benefit of society as a whole. Familiar texts such as Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics, and one of the earliest treatises we have on medicine, Soranus' treatise on gynecology, reveal how and why the care of defective newborns simply wasn't a medical concern in classical antiquity. There was no such thing as care of defective newborns. And what the concern was when there was what was understood as a monstrous birth was to protect the population as a whole against the ill effects associated with them. I hope that as I'm telling this story, some of the contemporary debates about how costly it is for certain people to not be aborted are in the back of your mind. The salient point is that in Greek and Roman antiquity, a person's value was largely defined in social terms. So John tried to press us to think about how our Christian faith and Christian worship is a social activity. Christianity was born in a world where every life was assessed in social terms. And so the individualism of part of the reason that we have to think through certain problems of disability ministry today is because we have a very individualistic view, but that's not the ancient view. And as John was pressing, it's probably not even an accurate view of where we are. So if human life is tied into the social world, then lives that are a burden, or as the ancient stories about the gods put the matter, lives that were curses, that were signs of a divine threat against a community, had to be done away with in order to protect the population. So if a life couldn't be understood to contribute both materially and through acquired virtues to the good of the family and society, it was not only legal, but it was morally incumbent for them to be done away with. This is why the martyrdom of early Christians was important, because it helped Christians to see what's going on when you prioritize the good of the state or the good of the family or the good of the clan over individual human lives. And that prioritization, they knew, was always going to end in killing. Christianity, thus, marked the turning point in late antiquity in holding that every human life has intrinsic value, right? That's an idea that Christians invented as they thought through what it meant that Jesus Christ was the Lord of every human being. Following Christ's message and example in the context of late antiquity, late antique morality, early theologians gave testimony, therefore, to a decidedly countercultural attitude towards human life. And they began then to think of new practices from the beginning of life to the end of life. And in hindsight, we can see that these very ad hoc, very individual, spontaneous practices of early Christians paved the way for the public institutions of charity for the socially excluded, institutions that today have now, we now know as the secular healthcare systems, right? So the very institution of the hospital in which care is provided to all people is directly related to the story that went on during this period of Christianity. In the Roman world, healthcare was a privilege that was either accorded only to those who could pay for it or to those who'd served the state, soldiers. And the earliest Christians, therefore, can be considered their strategies of resistance to the dominant attitudes toward the body and life more generally as valuable only if it's make a contribution to the community. Were the thin edge of the world that we know today, where we at least think people deserve health care no matter their condition, and that wealth or military service are not the only grounds on which we might care for human life. Now, let me just give you some of the primary text very briefly. These are the places where the rule of human solidarity began to be formulated. Let's start in North Africa. Tertullian lived from 160 to 220 AD, and he was, I've given you some snippets of him trying to persuade both Christians and non-Christians that they shouldn't go to the gladiatorial shows. And this is A on your handout. The man who, when he sees a quarrel on the streets coming to blows, will try to quiet or to express his strong disapproval. But in the stadium, he'll applaud fights far more dangerous. That he who shudders at the body of a man who died by nature's law, the common death of all, will, in the amphitheater, gaze down with most tolerant eyes on the bodies of men mangled, torn in pieces, defiled with their own blood. And the other man who was killed in the fight, he will have fetched back to take a look at his face, with more delight inspecting under his eyes the man he wished killed at a distance. And if he didn't wish it, so much the crueler he. So there's a very early sense among Christians that, and Tertullian often spoke as the face, as the image of God, that those sports and entertainments that revel in bloodletting or beating the face were direct insults to Christ. Right? So very early on, Christians are feeling that the example that what they've learned in the life of Christ and what it says about the human image in every human being is starting to push back against a lot of contemporary practice. Another contemporary practice is the refusal of abortion. And B, just the line on your handout under heading B is from the Didache, which is it was a catechetical text to teach Gentiles what it meant to be a Christian, and it included several updated, Gentilized parts of Hebrew scriptures. And the part in the Ten Commandments that it says, "Thou shalt not kill," was translated, as you have on B, "Thou shalt not murder a child by abortion nor kill them when born." So there was immediately a connection between the command, "Thou shalt not kill," and the refusal of abortion. To go back to Tertullian, this refusal, which wasn't really entirely theoretically worked out, but was practically very widespread among Christians, so widespread that Tertullian, when he's trying to defend Christians against the claim that they're bad for society, can point to the Christian community, which so monolithically refuses abortion that he can hold that up as proof that Christians are totally pro-life in the deepest possible sense. And if you look at C on your handout, he says, "In our case, murder being once and for all forbidden, we don't even destroy the fetus in the womb. To hinder a birth is merely a speedier man-killing. nor does it matter whether you take away a life that's born or destroy one that's coming to the birth. That's a man which is going to be one. You have the fruit already in its seed. So Tertullian gives us an example of how what for us is a kind of question of the woman's choice and the rights of the child was actually, for the early Christians, a huge countercultural strategy against all kinds of devaluations of non-productive life or violent ways of treating the human body. I want to end my remarks by looking in just a little bit more detail at one sermon preached around the year 370 in the cathedral at Caesarea, which is now in central Turkey, by Gregory of Nazianzus. Gregory and his student Basil of Caesarea worked very closely together. And as Rob knows, they were also hugely formative in Trinitarian theology. But what's far less known is their role in setting up some of the first institutions that were precursors of modern hospitals. Basil was a great patron of outsiders. He personally organized a soup kitchen and distributed food to the poor during a famine following a drought. And in doing so, he gave away his personal family inheritance to support the poor of his diocese. He also actively worked to reform thieves and prostitutes and publicly criticized civic officials who failed to administer justice. And he did it from the pulpit. So as Christianity, and now we're coming to 370, so this is right after the legalization of Christianity, when Christians could actually speak and build institutions in public, they pushed even harder toward the new moral sensibility in which every human life, because it's a partaker in the life of Christ, is to be taken with great seriousness. Most importantly, he built a large complex just outside of Caesarea called the Basilicad, which included a poorhouse, a hospice, and a hospital. Poorhouse being a place where the poor who basically never got health care before could get health care, hospice for people who were dying, and then just a hospital. And that was the first time that sort of institution had ever been built, and was regarded at the time as one of the wonders of the world. And I'm going to talk about a specific sermon. Its technical name is given there on the handout, Oration 14.8. And his sermon is best understood if we supposed that they were originally delivered in Caesarea during the years that Basil was developing and carrying out his philanthropic program. So these are the sermons that were preached alongside trying to get the church on board with this hospital complex that was being invented by his co-laborer. And he was trying in the forum of the church to appeal for support for these Basil's efforts in providing public care for the sick and the poor. One thing we have to remember is that politics hasn't always just happened out, on Capitol Hill or in political forums. That the ethos of the West was often born out of sermons. The political wasn't kept out of sermons. It was actually built in Christians saying, this is the good society. So I'm giving you an example of a homiletic appeal for moral action, and it enjoined individual Christians to assist those suffering, in this case, from leprosy, and which was particularly horrific visually, because as you probably run across at one point or another depictions of leprosy, but because there's loss of nerve feeling, the extremities tend to apparently wear away, and so we'll read a couple of depictions of the disfigurement that was such a horrific part of this disease. But my interest in looking at it is that it's a fascinating moment in the rise of the modern sensibility that characterizes our world, in which it's taken for granted that every life should be understood as worth our care. So think of this as the moment when the old world of Rome turns into the new world of Christendom, which is secularized to form, modern human rights talk. But it took 1,000 years for it to turn into human rights. Before that, it was, let's think about life in the light of the work of Christ. Okay, and now I'm just going to spend the last 5 or 10 minutes working through his sermon. And apologies for the long quotations, but I figured that you would find his own words more interesting than mine. So let's start with D on your handout. Here is the core theoretical affirmation of the early Christians, right? This is Gregory's summary of what I've called the rule of human solidarity. As I feel pain at the weakness of my own flesh and sense my own weakness in the sufferings of others, reason urges me to say this. Brothers and sisters, we must care for what is part of our nature and shares in our slavery. For even if I lay charges against it, that is my own body, because of its possibility, still I stand by it as a friend because of the one who bound me in it. Right? That's John Swinton's point, that I love my body not because it's just mine, but because it's the body that God gave to me. And we must, each of us, care no less for our neighbor's bodies than our own, the bodies both of those who are healthy and those who are consumed by leprosy. For we are all one in the Lord, whether rich or poor, whether slave or free. Galatians 3, whether in good health of body or in bad, and there is one head of all, from whom all things proceed, Christ. And what the limbs are to each other, each of us is to everyone else, and all to all. So we must by no means overlook or neglect to care for those who experience our common weakness before we do. Nor should we delight more in the fact that our bodies are in good condition than we grieve that our brother and sisters are in misery. Rather, we must consider this to be the single way towards the salvation both of our bodies and souls, human kindness shown toward them. So that's the premise. God bound us into this body. God bound our neighbors into their bodies. We care for our bodies. We should care for our neighbors and their bodies and their lives. Now he realizes that the worst case problem in his context is the leper. And he realizes that people shun lepers. And he realizes that the people in his church shun lepers. And so now we see a remarkable attempt to create empathy with lepers and other outcasts. And it's this drive toward empathy toward those who had been denied empathy which has laid the groundwork for the world in which we live. This is E on the handout. There stands before our eyes a terrible, pitiable sight, unbelievable to anyone who didn't know it was true. Human beings both dead and alive, mutilated in most parts of their body, scarcely recognizable either for who they are or where they come from. They are rather wretched remnants of once human beings. Of course, a very dangerous way to put it, but this is very early in Christians trying to think through how to articulate what we're after. As marks of identification, they call out the names of their fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters and homes. I'm the son of so-and-so, and so-and-so is my mother. This is my name. You were once my dear companion. They do this because they cannot be recognized by their former shape. They're truncated human beings, deprived of possessions, family and friends, and their very bodies, distinctive in being able both to pity themselves and to hate themselves at once. They're uncertain whether to lament for the parts of their bodies that no longer exist or for those that remain, those which the disease has consumed or those left for the disease to work on. The former have been consumed most wretchedly, the latter still more wretchedly preserved. The former have disappeared before their bodies are buried, the latter have no one that will give them a burial. Even the kindest and most humane of neighbors is insensitive to them. In this instance alone, we forget that we are flesh, clothed in this lowly body, and we are so far from caring for our fellow creatures that we think the safety of our own body lies in fleeing from theirs. One approaches a body that's been dead for some time, even if it's begun to reek. One carries about the stinking carcasses of brute animals and puts up with being full of filth, yet we avoid these lepers with all our might. What inhumanity! Almost taking offense at breathing the same air as they breathe. And that is one of the earliest examples we have of the language of inhumanity. And notice that it's being applied to those Christians who deny the humanity or the reality of the life of someone who they find repugnant, or who they find filthy, or who they find an outcast. So he makes the move to just point out the lack of empathy, the gap between the us and those other people who aren't really worthy of respect. Then he moves on to extend his appeal, his empathetic appeal, by depicting the grief of parents. And here, I would say, he provokes what I call an inversion of perception. And this inversion was to have a long history. Christians were to draw on this trope, and I think the trope is born in the Gospels when Jesus compares the Pharisees, for instance, to being blind, and suggests that their blindness is more significant than the physical blindness that he can heal. And this, so watch how the similar inversion of perception is as Gregory's way of trying to produce in his hearers a totally different stance toward the outcast. Who could be more upright than a father? Who more sympathetic than a mother? But nature's operation is shut off even for them. That is, their natural empathy for their own child. The father looks at his own child, whom he begot and raised, whom alone he considered the light of his life, for whom he prayed often and long to God, and now both grieves over that child and drives him away. The first willingly, and the second under compulsion, namely, the laws of the state refuse at the time to keep allowing him to keep that leprous child in his household. The mother recalls the pangs of childbirth, and her heart is torn apart. She calls his name wretchedly, and when he stands before her, she laments for her living child as if he were dead. Unfortunate child of a miserable mother, bitter disease has come to share you with me. And here is the inversion of perception. There have been instances when people have allowed a murderer to live with them, have shared not only their roof but their table with an adulterer, have chosen a person guilty of sacrilege as their life's companion, have made solemn covenants with those who have wished them harm. But in this person's case, suffering rather than any injury is handed down as a criminal charge. So crime has become more profitable than sickness, and we accept inhumanity as a fit behavior for a free society, while we look down on compassion as something to be ashamed of.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.